Okay, so as we work at thinking about how to give exhortations in a way that do not contribute to bounded group religiosity and rather facilitate living as a centered approach, centered on Jesus, I'd like to start this by giving two little exhortations myself. So we're going to call these Exhortation A and Exhortation B. And I'm going to exhort using the same biblical text. And as I do this, I invite you to observe differences between the two, and including, what I say, but also how they feel to you. Okay, you ready? Exhortation A. Well, I beseech you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. So what does Paul mean to us here in this verse? Present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Now, if you think about it for a moment, sacrifices for Paul at that time, what were they? Animals laid out, killed, offered onto an altar. So living sacrifice, it's really kind of an oxymoron, something that doesn't go together, living sacrifice. Well, I think that what Paul was getting at here was when he's saying sacrifice, he's saying to give our bodies to God as if we were dead. So a sacrifice is something dead but still living. So he's saying, brothers and sisters, give your bodies to God. Give your lives to God as if you were dead. So commit yourself so wholly to God as if you were dead. So as you're listening, I encourage you, in order to be a true Christian, this is something you should do. Give your life to God. Give it so fully to God in order to be a true Christian. Amen? Okay, so that was Exhortation A. Now, we do Exhortation B. Same text. What differences do you hear? Therefore, brothers and sisters, I beseech you by the mercies of God to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable worship. So how did this text start? This text from Romans 12, the first word is therefore. Now, when you see the word therefore in the Bible, nice little trick to remember is to ask, what's it there for? So, therefore. So we look to the verse beforehand, and what would we see? Some words of praise and to God. And so, therefore, well, I think this therefore is actually referring back to more than just these few verses right before the verse. I think this is actually a turning point in the whole letter to the Romans. So I think the therefore is taking us back to the very beginning. So what do we see in the first 11 chapters of Romans? Paul is talking about who we are as sinners, lost, how we've turned away from God, and then how God has taken the initiative, come back towards us, and through Jesus Christ, providing a way of salvation, working through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection to provide a way for us to be reunited with God, brought into God's covenant community. So the first 11 chapters of Romans are about what God has done, salvation offered to us. So when Paul gets here in chapter 12, I think what he's saying is therefore, because of all that God has done for you, because of God's great love for you, now, brothers and sisters, I invite you, present your bodies as a living sacrifice in response. Living sacrifice. Now, that's kind of a strange thing, especially if you think at the time of Paul. What was a sacrifice? A sacrifice was an animal put on an altar, killed, put on an altar, offered up to the gods. So those are sacrifices in his time. But he says living sacrifice. It's kind of an oxymoron. Living and sacrifice weren't things that went together. So what I think Paul is saying here is he's inviting the Romans to offer their lives to God so fully, it's as if they're dead. So I invite you to do the same. Thinking about all that God has done for you, respond by giving your lives to God. This is a God whom you can trust. Think of all that God has done for you, of God's great love for you. Trust your life to God. It's a great place for it to be. put it into God's hands. Amen. So what did you feel in exhortation A? What did you feel in exhortation B? How were they different? And I want to highlight here that when I do this, I try as much as possible to use the same words. And also I could say, I could make exhortation A a lot worse. I mean, I could make it very accusatory, scold you, leave you dripping with guilt. So I purposely tried to make it not horrible. But what did you notice? What's the big difference? The big difference between two exhortations is in exhortation B, I paid attention to the word therefore. And through that, I went back then and looked at the beginning of Romans. And did you feel the difference that made in the exhortation? By rooting it in what God had done, it changed the character of the whole exhortation. And that's something that in the lecture to come, you're going to read more about rooting the imperative, the command, in the indicative. And so that was the main thing. That's the main difference. And I give this little example to show there are small things we do which can change our exhortation, change the character of our exhortation from something that contributes to bounded group religiosity or contributes to a centered approach. And then there are a couple other little things I invite you to think. Maybe even replay this. Listen to them again. What differences do you note? So for instance, in the first one, there's a bit of a sense of, well, if you really want to be a true Christian, you should do this. And the second one was more invitational. There's probably some other differences you can find. As I said, I invite you to look through them again, think about it, and then go on to read some of the other things that we can learn from Paul and some ideas on my own on giving exhortations in a centered way that helps produce an ethic of freedom.